Europe begins with collision. Not of ships or armies, though there's been plenty of that, but of tectonic plates grinding together over millions of years, crumpling the Earth's crust into mountains that still define the continent's spine. From the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic coast to the Ural Mountains, this is not one place, but dozens, a patchwork of nations, languages, and histories squeezed into less than 4 million square miles, smaller than every other continent except Australia, yet somehow containing more cultural density than anywhere else on Earth. What makes Europe remarkable is not just its geography, but what humans built upon it. Civilizations that rose and fell, empires that conquered and collapsed, ideas that spread across borders and changed the world. Democracy, philosophy, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, all of it happened here, in this crowded corner of Eurasia where people couldn't help but collide, compete, and create. The word Europe comes from Greek mythology, named for a Phoenician princess abducted by Zeus. And that's fitting, because Europe has always been about borders crossed, cultures mixing, old worlds giving way to new. The story of this continent begins in the south, where mountains meet the sea. The Alps stretch across the heart of Europe, a barrier and a bridge between north and south. 8 countries claim a piece of them: France, Switzerland, Italy, Austria, Germany, Slovenia, Liechtenstein, Monaco. The mountains don't care about borders. They simply rise, their peaks cutting through clouds, their valleys carved by glaciers that retreated at the end of the last ice age. Switzerland shows what mountains can do to a culture. Landlocked, surrounded by larger powers, the Swiss turned isolation into identity. Valleys separated by high passes developed their own dialects, their own ways of life. The mountains made invasion difficult, so neutrality became policy. For over 200 years, Switzerland has stayed out of Europe's wars, watching empires rise and fall from behind granite walls. The Matterhorn rises on the border with Italy, a pyramid of rock so perfectly shaped it became the template for every mountain cartoon. Its north face, a vertical mile of stone and ice, wasn't climbed until 1931. Climbers still die on it every year, bodies sometimes found decades later, preserved in glacial ice. Below the peaks, Swiss villages cling to slopes at impossible angles. Zermatt sits at the base of the Matterhorn, a car-free town accessible only by train. Electric taxis buzz through narrow streets, and chalets built from dark timber and stone lean into the hillside like they're trying not to slide off. In winter, the town swells with skiers. In summer, hikers fill the trails, some heading toward Italy through high mountain passes that were trade routes centuries before tunnels and roads made them obsolete. The Alps are melting. Glaciers that took thousands of years to form are retreating at visible rates. The Aletsch Glacier, the largest in the Alps, has lost over 2 miles of length in the past century. Rock walls once held in place by ice are collapsing. Mountain faces that were permanently frozen for millennia now thaw every summer, sending avalanches of stone tumbling into valleys below. Ski resorts install snowmaking machines, but there's only so much artificial snow can do when winter temperatures rise above freezing. South of the Alps, the mountains descend toward warmth and light. Italy stretches into the Mediterranean like a boot, kicking Sicily toward Africa. The country's shape is so distinctive you can recognize it from space. A peninsula that divides the sea into eastern and western basins, creating trade routes that made this land wealthy long before nations existed. Rome sits in the center of it all, a city built on 7 hills, founded, according to legend, in 753 BC by brothers raised by a wolf. Whether or not that's true, Rome grew. It conquered. It built an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Mesopotamia. At its height, Rome controlled the Mediterranean so completely they called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. The Colosseum still stands, a massive oval of stone and arches where 50,000 people once watched gladiators fight, exotic animals slaughtered, prisoners executed. The floor that once covered the underground chambers is gone, exposing the network of tunnels and elevators used to bring fighters and beasts into the arena. You can see the machinery of spectacle, the infrastructure of violence. Nearby, the Roman Forum spreads across a valley between hills, columns, and foundations, marking where temples, markets, and government buildings once stood. This was the center of Roman public life, where senators debated, where crowds gathered to hear news of wars and triumphs. Now it's ruins, stones worn smooth by millions of footsteps, toppled by earthquakes and scavenged for building materials when Rome fell and the city shrank into the shadows of its former self. But Rome didn't disappear, it transformed. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the Catholic Church remained, and the Pope became the most powerful figure in the city. The Vatican, technically an independent nation, smaller than a city block, sits within Rome's borders, its influence extending far beyond its physical size. St. Peter's Basilica, built over the supposed tomb of the Apostle Peter, took over a century to complete. Its dome, designed by Michelangelo, dominates the skyline, visible from across the city. Inside, the Sistine Chapel ceiling shows Michelangelo's other masterpiece, hundreds of figures depicting scenes from Genesis, painted over 4 years while lying on scaffolding. The creation of Adam, God's finger reaching toward the first man, is one of the most reproduced images in history. Yet seeing it in person, neck craned in the dim chapel, surrounded by tourists whispering in a dozen languages, the scale and detail make it clear why people travel thousands of miles to stand here. North of Rome, Florence holds the Renaissance, the movement that rediscovered classical learning, that valued human potential, that produced art and architecture still studied 600 years later. The Duomo, Florence's cathedral, is crowned by Brunelleschi's dome, an engineering feat that puzzled experts for centuries. No one knew how he built it, how he supported the weight during construction without traditional scaffolding. He used a double shell design, one dome inside another with hidden ribs distributing the load. It worked. The dome still stands, red terracotta tiles catching the afternoon light, visible from every corner of the city. The Uffizi Gallery holds paintings by Botticelli, Leonardo, Raphael, Caravaggio, Birth of Venus, Venus rising from the sea on a shell, hair flowing in an impossible wind, Annunciation, the angel Gabriel telling Mary her fate, Leonardo's precision in every fold of fabric, every feather on Gabriel's wings. These aren't just paintings, they're ideas made visible, theology and mythology rendered in oil and tempera, meant to inspire, educate, and overwhelm. Florence was a city-state, wealthy from banking and trade, ruled by families like the Medici, who funded artists and architects, who collected manuscripts and commissioned works that defined an era. The Medici weren't saints, they were politicians and bankers, ruthless when needed, but their patronage left a legacy that outlasted their power. Venice, built on a lagoon where no city should exist, rises from the Adriatic on wooden pilings driven into mud. Over 100 islands connected by bridges, canals instead of streets, boats instead of cars. The Grand Canal curves through the city, palaces lining both banks, their facades reflecting in water that's green with algae and heavy with the weight of centuries. Gondolas glide past, the gondoliers singing for tourists, though the tradition is real even if the performance feels staged. St. Mark's Square, the city center, floods regularly. Aqua alta, high water caused by tides and wind pushing seawater into the lagoon. Platforms are set up so people can walk above the water, and Venetians pull on rubber boots and go about their day. But the floods are getting worse. The city is sinking slowly while sea levels rise. Engineering projects, massive flood barriers that can be raised to block high tides, offer temporary solutions. But Venice is fighting a losing battle against water, the same element that made it powerful. The Venetian Republic lasted over 1,000 years, from the 7th century until Napoleon dissolved it in 1797. It controlled trade routes between Europe and Asia, its merchants bringing silk, spices, and knowledge from the East. The wealth shows in the architecture, in the mosaics covering St. Mark's Basilica, in the paintings by Titian and Tintoretto hanging in palaces and churches, but nothing lasts forever. The Republic fell, the empire faded, and now Venice survives on tourism, a museum of itself, beautiful and fragile. North of Italy, beyond the Alps, the landscape flattens and the culture shifts. France holds the heart of Western Europe, a hexagon of varied terrain from Mediterranean beaches to Atlantic coasts, from alpine peaks to rolling farmland. Paris sits near the center on the Seine, a city that became synonymous with art, fashion, revolution, and a certain idea of what a city should be. The Eiffel Tower was temporary. Built for the 1889 World's Fair, it was supposed to be dismantled after 20 years. Engineers and artists hated it, calling it an eyesore, a metal skeleton that ruined Paris's skyline. But it stayed. It became the symbol of the city of France of the modern age. From the top, Paris spreads in every direction, a planned city of wide boulevards and uniform buildings, designed in the 19th century by Baron Haussmann, who tore down medieval neighborhoods to create the Paris that exists today. The Louvre, a palace-turned-museum, holds more art than anyone can see in a day. The Mona Lisa hangs behind bulletproof glass, smaller than people expect, her smile neither mysterious nor obvious, just the face of a Florentine merchant's wife, painted by Leonardo da Vinci 500 years ago. Yet millions line up to see it, to take photos they'll never look at again, to say they were there. Notre Dame Cathedral, damaged by fire in 2019, is being rebuilt. The flames consumed the wooden roof and toppled the spire, but the stone structure survived. The restoration is meticulous, craftsmen using medieval techniques to replace beams and carvings. When it reopens, it will look as it did, but it won't be the same. Fire changes things even after the rebuilding. France is also the countryside, vineyards covering hillsides in Burgundy and Bordeaux, grapes that become wine sold around the world, lavender fields in Provence, purple rose, stretching toward horizons under a sun that bleaches stone houses white. The Loire Valley, where chateaux rise from farmland, Renaissance castles built by kings and nobles who wanted to display their wealth and power in architecture, Chambord, with its double helix staircase supposedly designed by Leonardo, 440 rooms, most of which were never lived in. It was never about practicality, it was about showing what could be done. West of France, across the English Channel, Britain sits at the edge of Europe, an island that spent centuries pretending it wasn't. London sprawls along the Thames, a city rebuilt after fires and bombs, layers of history stacked on top of each other. Roman walls still stand in places, medieval churches sit next to glass skyscrapers, and the Thames flows through it all, brown and tidal, carrying ships that once brought goods from every corner of the British Empire. The Tower of London, a fortress built by William the Conqueror in the 11th century, held prisoners, housed the royal mint, stored the crown jewels. Anne Boleyn was executed here, beheaded on Tower Green, for adultery she probably didn't commit. Her crime was failing to give Henry VIII a male heir. The tower is a museum now. Tourists lining up to see jewels and armor, yeoman warders in Tudor costumes telling stories of executions and intrigue. Westminster Abbey holds the bones of kings and poets, Charles Darwin, Isaac Newton, Geoffrey Chaucer, all buried here. Coronations happen in this church. Every British monarch since 1066 crowned on the same chair, a wooden throne so old and plain it looks like it belongs in a farmhouse. But underneath, embedded in the seat, sits the stone of Scone, taken from Scotland in the 13th century as a symbol of conquest. It was returned in 1996, but only temporarily. For coronations, it comes back to Westminster. Outside London, England's countryside rolls in gentle hills and hedgerows. Stonehenge rises on Salisbury Plain, massive stones arranged in a circle, built in stages over 1,500 years. No one knows exactly why. Theories range from astronomical observatory to religious temple to healing site. What's clear is the effort. The largest stones weigh 25 tons and were transported from quarries 20 miles away. Smaller bluestones came from Wales, over 150 miles. This was a project that consumed generations, built by people who left no written record, only the stones themselves. Bath, a Roman spa town, still has hot springs bubbling up at 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The Romans built elaborate baths here, temples and pools fed by natural springs. The Georgians rediscovered the baths in the 18th century and built a city of honey-colored stone around them. Jane Austen lived here, hated it, and wrote about it anyway. The baths are empty now, the water too contaminated to swim in, but steam still rises from the green pools, a reminder that the earth is warm beneath our feet. Scotland, north of England, is mountains and lochs, highlands emptied by clearances in the 18th and 19th centuries when landlords evicted tenants to make room for sheep. Villages disappeared, families emigrated, and the land became romantically desolate, the kind of emptiness tourists pay to see. Edinburgh, the capital, is built on volcanic rock, a castle perched on a cliff overlooking the city. The Royal Mile descends from the castle toward Holyrood Palace, narrow alleys called closes branching off, steep staircases connecting different levels of the medieval town. In August, The city fills with performers for the Edinburgh Festival, the largest arts festival in the world. Streets crowded with actors handing out flyers, musicians playing on corners, comedians trying out material in cramped venues. East of Britain, the continent continues in flatlands and forests. The Netherlands exists because the Dutch built it. A quarter of the country lies below sea level, protected by dikes, dams, and pumps. Without them, the sea would reclaim the land in days. Polders, land reclaimed from the sea, form some of the most productive farmland in Europe, tulips and vegetables grown on soil that was once underwater. Amsterdam, built on pilings like Venice, is a city of canals and bicycles. The canals form concentric rings around the old center. 17th century houses leaning at odd angles, their foundations shifting in the soft ground. Anne Frank hid in an attic on Prinsengracht Canal, writing in her diary while Nazi soldiers patrolled the streets below. The house is a museum now, the attic preserved, the diary translated into dozens of languages. It's a small space, cramped and dark, and it's almost impossible to imagine living there for 2 years, silent, afraid, waiting. The Netherlands is also polders and dikes, windmills that once pumped water out of flooded land, now restored as tourist attractions. The country fights a constant battle against the sea, a battle it's winning for now. But sea levels are rising, storms are getting stronger, and the Dutch are planning for a future where the water might win. Germany sits at the center of Europe, bordered by 9 countries, a crossroads that's been both an advantage and a curse. Berlin is a city that's been destroyed and rebuilt more times than almost anywhere. Bombed flat in World War II, divided by a wall for nearly 30 years, reunified in 1990. The wall is mostly gone now, fragments preserved as memorials, a line of bricks in the pavement marking where it stood. The East Side Gallery, a remaining section, is covered in murals, art painted on concrete that once divided a city. The Brandenburg Gate, Berlin's symbol, stood in no man's land when the wall went up, inaccessible from either side. Now it's the center of a reunified city, traffic flowing through its arches, tourists posing for photos. Nearby, The Holocaust Memorial, a field of concrete blocks arranged in a grid, invites visitors to walk between them. The ground uneven, the blocks growing taller as you move toward the center. It's disorienting, deliberately so. You can see out, but you can't see everything, and the deeper you go, the more oppressive it becomes. Munich in Bavaria is beer halls and Alps, Oktoberfest and Lederhosen. It's also where Hitler's beer hall putsch failed in 1923, where the Nazi Party was born, where history took one of its darkest turns. The city rebuilt after the war, restoring Baroque churches and medieval gates, creating a city that looks old even where it's new. The Rhine River flows through western Germany, past castles perched on cliffs, past vineyards planted on slopes so steep workers need harnesses to harvest. The river was a trade route, a border, a highway that connected the heart of Europe to the North Sea. Now it's a tourist route, cruise ships gliding past Lorelei Rock, where legend says a siren lured sailors to their deaths. East of Germany, the continent stretches toward Russia, a transition from Western to Eastern Europe that's as much about culture and history as geography. Poland suffered in the 20th century, invaded by Nazi Germany in 1939, occupied by the Soviet Union afterward, millions killed in concentration camps and ghettos. Auschwitz, the largest Nazi death camp, sits in southern Poland. Brick barracks and gas chambers preserved as a memorial. Over 1 million people, mostly Jews, were murdered here, their bodies burned in crematoria, their ashes dumped in ponds and fields. Walking through Auschwitz is not educational in a traditional sense. It's overwhelming, horrifying, necessary. The piles of shoes, the human hair, the photographs of faces staring from behind wire fences. These weren't abstractions, they were people. Warsaw, the capital, was leveled during the war, over 85% of the city destroyed. The old town was rebuilt brick by brick, following old photographs and drawings, creating a replica of what was lost. It's not authentic, but it's real. The Poles rebuilt their city as an act of defiance, refusing to let the destruction be permanent. Kraków, Poland's former capital, survived the war largely intact. Its Old Town Square, one of the largest in Europe, is surrounded by medieval buildings, cafes spilling onto cobblestones. A trumpeter playing from the tower of St. Mary's Basilica every hour, a tradition dating back centuries. The melody ends abruptly, mid-note, commemorating a trumpeter killed by an arrow while warning the city of a Mongol attack in 1241. History here isn't distant. It's present, repeated every hour, a reminder that the past shapes the present. South of Poland, the Danube River flows east, past Vienna, Budapest, and Belgrade, connecting Central Europe to the Black Sea. Vienna, once the capital of the Habsburg Empire, is a city of palaces and music. Schönbrunn Palace, the summer residence of emperors, holds 1,141 rooms, gilded ceilings, and gardens that stretch for acres. Mozart performed here as a child. Beethoven premiered his symphonies in Vienna's concert halls, and the waltz, that spinning dance of elegance and restraint, was born here. But Vienna is also the city where Freud developed psychoanalysis, where Klimt painted golden portraits of society women, where the 20th century's ideas about the unconscious mind and modern art took shape. The city preserved its imperial past while inventing the modern world, a balance between tradition and innovation that defines much of Europe. Budapest, downstream on the Danube, is two cities. Buda, hilly and historic, sits on one bank. Pest, flat and commercial, sits on the other. Bridges connect them. The most famous, the Chain Bridge, a suspension bridge built in the 19th century that became a symbol of Hungarian identity. The Hungarian Parliament building, a Gothic revival masterpiece, sits on the pest side, its facade reflecting in the river at night, lit by golden lights. Inside, the crown of St. Stephen, Hungary's most sacred relic, is guarded in a room under the dome. Budapest is also thermal baths, hot springs that feed pools and spas. Széchenyi Baths, with its outdoor pool steaming in winter, draws locals and tourists who soak in water heated by the earth, playing chess on floating boards, relaxing in water that Romans bathed in 2,000 years ago. Further east, past the Carpathian Mountains, Europe begins to blur into Asia. The Ural Mountains, low and worn, mark the traditional boundary, though the distinction is more cultural than geographic. Europe is an idea as much as a place. Defined by shared history, Christianity, languages descended from Latin and Germanic roots, but it's also contested. Is Russia European? Is Turkey? The answers depend on who's asking and why. Greece in the southeast sits where Europe meets the Mediterranean, where mountains drop into blue water, where islands scatter across the Aegean like stones thrown by gods. Athens rises around the Acropolis, a rocky hill crowned by the Parthenon. The temple, built in the 5th century BC, was dedicated to Athena, goddess of wisdom and war. It's a ruin now, columns standing but incomplete. Sculptures removed to museums in London and Athens. Yet even ruined, it dominates the city, a reminder that Western civilization traces many of its ideas to this place. Democracy, philosophy, theater, all of it started here, in a city-state small by modern standards, but outsized in influence. The islands are what draw most visitors. Santorini, volcanic and dramatic, with whitewashed buildings clinging to cliffs above a caldera. The island is the remnant of a volcano that exploded 3,600 years ago, one of the largest eruptions in human history. The blast may have destroyed the Minoan civilization on nearby Crete, and some believe it inspired the legend of Atlantis. Today, tourists fill the narrow streets of Oia, watching sunsets over the caldera, photographing blue-domed churches against white walls, an image so iconic it's become shorthand for Greek islands. Crete, the largest Greek island, holds the ruins of Knossos, palace of the legendary King Minos. The palace, partially reconstructed, shows frescoes of dolphins and acrobats, bull-leaping rituals frozen in paint. Whether the Minotaur's labyrinth existed here is debatable, but the myth endures, a story of sacrifice and heroism that still resonates. The Greek islands number over 6,000, though only 227 are inhabited. Each has its character. Mykonos, cosmopolitan and crowded. Rhodes, with its medieval walls built by crusading knights. Corfu, green and Italian influenced. The islands are connected by ferries that hop between them, carrying tourists and locals, goods and cars, maintaining links that have existed for millennia. North of Greece, the Balkans stretch toward Central Europe, a region of mountains, valleys, and conflicts that shaped the 20th century. The region's history is complicated, layered with empires that came and went: Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, Byzantine, Roman. Religions mixed and clashed: Orthodox Christianity, Catholicism, Islam. Languages diverged, cultures blended and fought. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914 triggered World War I, and the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s brought war back to Europe, proving that old hatreds don't disappear just because time passes. Croatia's Dalmatian coast along the Adriatic is a string of islands and medieval towns. Dubrovnik, surrounded by massive stone walls, served as a filming location for Game of Thrones, its streets and fortifications standing in for a fictional city. But Dubrovnik is real, a city-state that competed with Venice, that survived earthquakes and sieges, that was shelled in 1991 during Croatia's War of Independence. The walls protected the old town mostly, and restoration has been meticulous. You can walk the walls looking down at red roofs and marble streets out at the blue Adriatic and see a city that survived because it was built to last. Spain and Portugal on the Iberian Peninsula mark Europe's southwestern edge. Spain is bullfights and flamenco, Moorish palaces and Catholic cathedrals, a country where Islamic and Christian cultures collided for centuries. The Alhambra in Granada is the finest example of Moorish architecture in Europe. A palace of intricate tilework, arched courtyards, and water features designed to create paradise on earth. The Catholic monarchs conquered Granada in 1492, ending 800 years of Islamic rule in Iberia. The same year, Columbus sailed west, finding the Americas and beginning Spain's empire. Barcelona on the Mediterranean coast is Gaudi's city. The Sagrada Familia, his unfinished cathedral, has been under construction since 1882. Gaudí spent the last years of his life working on it, and when he died, hit by a tram in 1926, the work continued on. It's scheduled for completion in 2026, though that's been said before. The building defies categorization, organic and geometric at once, towers rising like melting candles, facades covered in sculptures of biblical scenes. Inside, columns branch like trees, light filtering through stained glass, turning the stone into something alive. Portugal, smaller and quieter, faces the Atlantic. Lisbon climbs 7 hills. Trams rattling up narrow streets, yellow buildings with iron balconies, tiles covering walls in geometric patterns. The city was destroyed by an earthquake in 1755, one of the deadliest in history. Followed by a tsunami and fires that consumed what the quake left standing. The city rebuilt, creating the grid of streets in the Baixa district, but the memory remains. Portugal was a sea power, explorers sailing from Lisbon to map the world. Vasco da Gama reached India. Magellan's expedition circumnavigated the globe. The age of discovery brought wealth and colonies, but also slavery and exploitation. The legacy is complicated. Monuments to explorers standing beside reminders of what exploration cost. North of Spain, the Pyrenees separate Iberia from France, a natural border that's also culturally distinct. The Basque country straddles the mountains, a region with its own language unrelated to any other in Europe, its own identity that predates Spain and France. The Basques have sought independence for generations, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently. The conflict has quieted, but the identity remains. Scandinavia in the north is forests and fjords, long winters and short summers, a region shaped by ice. Norway's coastline is carved by glaciers into deep fjords, steep-sided valleys flooded by the sea. Geiranger Fjord, one of the most photographed, drops over 800 feet from mountain to water, waterfalls tumbling from cliffs, farms clinging to slopes that seemed too steep for anything. The fjords were highways for Vikings, longships rowing and sailing along protected waters, raiding and trading from Scotland to Constantinople. Bergen on Norway's west coast was a Hanseatic trading post, wooden buildings lining the waterfront, painted in reds and yellows. The city gets rain 239 days a year, but when the sun comes out, the colors glow against green hills and blue water. The Lofoten Islands, above the Arctic Circle, are jagged peaks rising from the sea, fishing villages built on stilts over the water, cod dries on racks, hung by the thousands, the smell overwhelming in summer. The midnight sun never sets from May to July, and the northern lights dance in winter, green curtains shimmering across the sky, a phenomenon caused by solar particles hitting the atmosphere but feeling like magic. Sweden, larger and flatter, is forests and lakes. Stockholm spread across 14 islands, where Lake Mälaren meets the Baltic Sea. The city is clean, modern, designed with an eye toward livability and sustainability. The Vasa Museum holds a 17th century warship that sank on its maiden voyage, salvaged in the 1960s and preserved. The ship, massive and ornate, was too top-heavy, too ambitious. It sailed less than a mile before tipping and going down. Now it sits in a museum, a reminder that even empires make mistakes. Iceland, an island between Europe and North America, sits on the mid-Atlantic ridge where tectonic plates pull apart. The island is geologically young, volcanic and active, geysers erupting on schedule, hot springs heating homes and pools. The landscape is barren, almost lunar, lava fields covered in moss, glaciers grinding toward the sea. Reykjavik, the capital, is small and colorful, the world's northernmost capital, a base for exploring the island's interior. Thingvellir National Park marks where the North American and Eurasian plates diverge, a rift valley you can walk through, standing between continents. Nearby, Geysir gives its name to all geysers, though it rarely erupts now. Strokr, next to it, erupts every few minutes, water shooting 60 feet into the air. Europe's story is one of constant change. Empires rose and fell, borders shifted, peoples migrated. Wars devastated the continent twice in the 20th century, killing tens of millions, destroying cities, shattering the certainty that progress was inevitable. Yet Europe rebuilt, creating the European Union, an attempt to bind nations together through economics and shared governance, to make war unthinkable by making cooperation necessary. It's an imperfect project. Brexit proved that not everyone wants to be part of it. Economic crises revealed cracks in the foundation. Refugees fleeing war and poverty test the limits of solidarity. Nationalism resurfaces, old grievances unresolved. But the continent endures. The Alps still rise, their glaciers melting, but their peaks unchanged. The Mediterranean still washes against ancient shores, ruins standing as reminders of what was and what can be lost. The rivers still flow, connecting interior to coast, carrying commerce and culture. The cities still stand, layered with history, monuments to ambition and resilience. And the people, descendants of Romans and Vikings, of philosophers and revolutionaries, continue to live on this crowded peninsula, connected by history, language, and an understanding that Europe is not just a place, but an idea, fragile and contested, built and rebuilt generation after generation.